In this lecture, we're going to finish talking about the Reagan administration and talk about the fall of communism. So during the end of the Reagan administration, the economy began to change, and prices of food fell dramatically, and farmers couldn't pay their bills. A lot of farmers were going out of business, and manufacturing jobs. These are jobs in factories. Um, Began to fall off. There were layoffs. People were laid off their jobs. Plants or factories began to close. This is all telling of an upcoming slowing of the economy. The the gap between wealthy and poor became wider, which means that the money within the United States was unevenly distributed. The widest gap between the rich and the poor since before the New Deal. Give you an example, for the top 5% of the country during the 80s, incomes rose 23%, and for the bottom 5%, income rose 4%. So things were getting good and better for the rich, and things were getting not good for the poor. For Reagan, he delegated a lot of responsibilities in his White House. He considered himself a manager. He didn't have to be in every decision, although he supported the decisions of the people who worked for him, which came back to bite him during something called the savings and loan scandal, where um, savings and loans give mortgages for people. They make up home mortgages, which is basically loans so you can buy a house. The government made it a lot easier to create risky mortgages, which a risky mortgage is maybe a mortgage given to somebody who has not demonstrated the ability to pay that money back. And when those mortgages could not be paid back and those savings and loans, which are kind of like banks, failed because they couldn't collect the money, taxpayers had to come in and pay billions of dollars because all those savings and loans had depositors insurance, which we've talked about during the FDR era, which guarantees your money is safe, and guarantees the bank that their money is safe to loan out. Finally, there's something called the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan wanted to help defeat the Sandinistas, which was a communist rebel group in Nicaragua, and he pumped money in. The problem was that the CIA secretly trained and armed rebels to fight, which is against the law, and to make money to pay for those rebels to fight, we sold weapons to our enemies, which mostly was Iran. Reagan claimed he had no idea this was going on, but it was a scandal within his administration. In the end, here were his successes. He worked really closely with the new Russian leader Gorbachev, who we'll talk about in a second, and he had trouble containing the size of government. The economy was deeply troubled by the time he left office, but the most important thing for Reagan, which is sort of like the most important thing for FDR, was he restored national pride. He was a very optimistic person. He gave a strong front to the rest of the world. It was the most confident America had been since the Kennedy years. And when he left office, his vice president ran for president, and that was George H.W. Bush. We are not going to get to the Gulf War, unfortunately. So here's George H.W. Bush. This is the Bush that you know. This is his father. And George H.W. Bush is interesting because in the 1988 election, this was a guy who was a World War II hero. He was a successful businessman in Texas in oil. He had been a congressman from Texas, and he had been the former head of the CIA and vice president of the United States. This guy had a resume unparalleled. In the campaign, he had promised no new taxes. He raised taxes, and that came back to bite him, and was one of the reasons he got beat by Bill Clinton when he ran for re-election. But what I want to talk about during his administration, the most important thing that happened was the end of the Cold War. There was new leadership in Russia, led by a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev had something called a policy he invented, or he developed, called glasnost, which means political openness, which was a new idea for communism. He also had something called perestroika, which meant restructuring. He was going to allow some free enterprise, sort of modeled on the U.S. system in Russia, to revitalize the failing economy there. And he worked really closely with Reagan and then later with Bush to thaw the Cold War tensions. In fact, he and Reagan had a great relationship, and that was continued with he and George H.W. Bush. Signed a bunch of new treaties, a bunch of new trade agreements. They both visit each other's country often. Gorbachev encouraged his satellite nations, all the nations the Soviet Union took up or took over after World War II around, including East Germany, to adopt glasnost. And this gave anti-communists in that region of Europe hope that communism could eventually end. The first sign that it was going to end was in Poland. In Poland, because of perestroika, restructuring, the shipyard workers in Poland were allowed to create a labor union for the first time in history. They were led by Lech Walesa, who you see here giving a speech, and he created a movement to create a labor union, which sparked a nationwide movement called Solidarity, and it was all about creating a democracy and getting rid of communism. Eventually, the communist government allowed free elections in Poland, and this guy became president. Lech Walesa became president of Poland, first democratically elected president of Poland since before World War II. Now, all the countries that were taken over by the Soviet Union looked at this and said, what about us? In East Berlin, throughout Russia's satellites, nations broke out in protest and revolt. And in East Berlin and West Berlin, defections and protests eventually led to one day, without any warning at all, one day, the East Berlin government began to take down the Berlin Wall between East and West Berlin, that city divided in East Germany. The wall came down. And within a month, the Communist Party was pretty much gone in East Germany. And within a year, East and West Germany were reunited. In the Soviet Union, communist hardliners pretty much took Gorbachev captive and forced him to resign. And this led to this guy right here, Boris Yeltsin, who was the mayor of Moscow. He led the protests against the communist government, and the hardliners tried to take over the government, but that takeover, which would be called a coup, that takeover failed, and the 15 satellite nations began to move towards independence, and Russia elected a new president and began to become a democracy. The former Soviet Union is now replaced by an alliance between countries. And this guy, Boris Yeltsin, who you see here, was the former mayor of Moscow, became the first democratically elected president in the history of Russia. Because before communism, they had a dictator named a czar. Today, they're called the former Soviet Union, or today the Soviet Union is called the Alliance of Former Socialist Republics. There is just Russia, which is the largest country on earth, but all these little countries that used to be controlled by the Soviet Union, these Baltic countries and these Eurasian countries here, they are now aligned with Russia, but independent. They have their own elections, and they have their own presidents, and that's what the country looks like now. There's Russia. This was all one country at one time, the Soviet Union. Now it's Russia with all these other countries, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia. All these other countries are independent but still aligned with Russia politically and economically, for sure. And there is a new international role for the United States. President Bush continues to work with Yeltsin and Russia. Russia begins to rebuild itself into a democratic country, and we are left as the lone superpower in the world, which leads to 2 wars in the Middle East, a war on terror, and China nipping at our tail, trying to create themselves into a superpower, which will probably happen in your lifetime. And that's the lecture.